Welcome back to Warm Pages, where we warm hearts with stories as comforting as your morning coffee. I'm your host, Harry, and today we're steeping ourselves in the world of Miss Marple. Now tell me, isn't it wonderful how stories bring us together, no matter where we are in this big world? Before we begin, I'd love to know which corner of the world are you enjoying this story from today? I'm reading every single one. Let's get started. Miss Marple and the Music Box Murder. Chapter 1. A Fatal Dinner Party. The leaden skies that hung over St. Mary Mead that October evening seemed to Miss Jane Marple an ominous prelude to what would unfold at Thornfield Manor. The Tudor edifice, with its dark timbers and mullioned windows, loomed against the gathering dusk as the vicar's automobile crunched along the gravel drive. Miss Marple adjusted her lace collar, aware that her presence at Sir Edgar Carrington's dinner party was, at best, tolerated rather than welcomed. "My dear," whispered Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, as they approached the impressive oak door, "I do hope Sir Edgar won't be too displeased at our bringing you, but when Lady Carrington mentioned they needed an extra lady, I thought immediately of you." "Oh, I shan't be any trouble," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile that belied her keen eyes. "I'm quite accustomed to sitting quietly in corners." The corners of Thornfield Manor, as it transpired, held secrets that even its master could not have fathomed. Sir Edgar Carrington greeted his guests with the practiced cordiality of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He was tall, with the robust physique of a gentleman who had not allowed age to diminish his presence. His silver hair was impeccably groomed, his evening clothes beyond reproach, yet Miss Marple observed the tightness around his eyes when they fell upon her. "Clement," he said, addressing the vicar, and Mrs. Clement, "how good of you to brave this inclement weather. And Miss Marple, is it not? I believe we met at the church fete last summer." "Indeed, Sir Edgar, most kind of you to remember," she replied, noting how his gaze had already moved past her to the more distinguished arrivals behind. The drawing-room into which they were ushered glowed with the light of an unnecessarily large fire and numerous beeswax candles. Lady Carrington, Lydia, moved among her guests with a grace that seemed almost studied. She was perhaps 30 years younger than her husband, with auburn hair arranged in an elegant coiffure that emphasized her fine-boned features. Her midnight blue gown, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps a trifle too sophisticated for a country dinner, however grand. "Miss Marple," Lady Carrington exclaimed with a warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. "How delightful! You must meet our other guests." These introductions were performed with swift efficiency. Frederick Carrington, Sir Edgar's son from his first marriage, a thin young man with a perpetual furrow between his brows. Miss Mildred Carrington, Sir Edgar's spinster sister, whose attentive gaze missed nothing. Dr. Rawlings, the family physician, portly and pink-cheeked. Professor Hammond, a distinguished musicologist with strikingly dark eyes beneath silver brows, and Miss Eliza Delaney, a young pianist whose delicate beauty seemed at odds with her nervous demeanor. Dinner was served in a paneled dining room beneath the impassive gaze of Carrington ancestors. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, though Miss Marple, from her position near the foot of the table, detected undercurrents that suggested not all was harmonious within the household. "I suppose, father, that your latest acquisition has arrived safely?" Frederick inquired with a smile that did not disguise the edge in his voice. "Indeed," Sir Edgar replied, "and without requiring any financial intervention from your quarter, I'm pleased to say." The brief silence that followed this exchange was broken by Professor Hammond. "Lady Carrington tells me you've acquired the Rendell music box. A remarkable find if it's the one I'm thinking of." "The very same," Sir Edgar said, visibly gratified. "I outbid several museums for it, including mine," the professor murmured with a glance toward Lydia that Miss Marple found curious. Throughout the meal, Miss Marple observed how Mildred Carrington's sharp eyes followed her sister-in-law's every movement, how Dr. Rawlings attended to Sir Edgar with the exaggerated concern of a physician monitoring a potentially serious condition, and how young Miss Delaney started whenever addressed directly. "You shall all see it after dinner," Sir Edgar pronounced as the dessert plates were being removed. "A marvelous piece with a most fascinating history. It once belonged to Marie Antoinette herself, though she never heard its full melody. A rather prophetic detail, as you'll understand when you hear it." The library, to which they adjourned for coffee, was Sir Edgar's domain. Books lined the walls, but it was the glass-fronted cabinets containing mechanical curiosities that drew the eye. Sir Edgar moved to a velvet-draped table at the center of the room and, with the flourish of a conjurer, removed the covering to reveal a box of such exquisite craftsmanship that a murmur of appreciation rippled through the assembled company. "Observe the detail," he instructed, lifting the ornate music box from its case. The painted scenes adorning its surface depicted rustic vignettes that, upon closer inspection, formed a narrative sequence. At that moment, the telephone in the hall rang shrilly. Sir Edgar frowned. "Excuse me," he said, setting the box down and moving toward the door. And then, a curious thing happened. The music box, untouched by human hand, began to play. The melody that filled the room was haunting, a minor key progression that seemed to speak of ancient sorrows and unresolved griefs. Sir Edgar turned back, his expression shifting from annoyance to astonishment. He took 3 steps toward the table, one hand outstretched as if to silence the unexpected music, the other clutching at his chest. His face contorted, he gasped once, and then collapsed heavily onto the Aubusson carpet. In the chaos that followed, it was Dr. Rawlings who took command, kneeling beside the stricken man, checking for signs of life with practiced hands. But even as Lady Carrington was led away, sobbing by her maid, and Frederick stood frozen in apparent shock, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Professor Hammond. The musicologist was staring at the still-playing box with an expression that could only be described as horrified recognition. Later that night, as a storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke over Thornfield Manor, Miss Marple lay awake in the guest room assigned to her. The household had been persuaded to remain in situ until the authorities could arrive in the morning, the country roads being quite impassable in such weather, as the vicar had pointed out. It was as she was finally drifting towards sleep that she heard it, 2 voices in the corridor outside her room. One belonged to Professor Hammond, the other to Miss Delaney. "That tune," the professor was saying, his voice low but distinct. "It's the ballad of Lord Rendell's betrayal. Most versions have been lost to time, but it tells of a nobleman poisoned by his lover, followed by a cycle of revenge killings. Rather macabre coincidence, wouldn't you say?" The young woman's reply was inaudible, but the tension in the professor's response was unmistakable. "We'll speak of this tomorrow. Go back to your room now." Miss Marple heard the soft tread of feet moving away. Sleep, she knew, would be long in coming now, and she was right, for at precisely midnight, the distant strains of the music box once again echoed through the darkened corridors of Thornfield Manor. The scream that followed, piercing and terrible, confirmed what Miss Marple had already begun to suspect, that Sir Edgar's death was merely the opening movement in a symphony of revenge that had been years in the orchestration. Chapter 2. The musicologist's knowledge. The scream that had shattered the midnight silence sent Miss Marple hurrying into the corridor, where she found herself joined by other equally startled guests. The vicar's wife, clutching her dressing gown tightly around her ample figure, looked positively ashen. "Oh dear," murmured Miss Marple. "I rather think we should go downstairs." The library, when they reached it, presented a tableau that Miss Marple would later describe to her friend Dolly Bantry as most distressing though remarkably informative. Professor Hammond lay slumped forward over Sir Edgar's desk, the ornate silver letter opener that had earlier been used to slit open the Evening Post, now protruding from between his shoulder blades. Most curious of all, the music box sat open before him on the desk, the very same music box that Sir Edgar had locked in his study before his collapse. "This is monstrous!" exclaimed Frederick Carrington, who had appeared in silk pajamas and a burgundy dressing gown. "First my father, and now this. What in God's name is happening?" Dr. Rawlings, still fully dressed despite the late hour, pushed past to examine the body. "He's been dead less than an hour, I should say." He lifted the professor's limp wrist, then let it fall. His gaze moved to a crystal tumbler on the desk. "He's been drinking brandy." Miss Marple, observing from a discreet distance, noticed the few dark drops remaining in the glass. There was something about their viscosity that struck her as odd, thicker than brandy ought to be. "Like poor Mrs. Saunders' blackberry cordial when it had gone off," she murmured to herself. "Though in this case, I suspect the addition was rather more deliberate." The storm continued to rage outside, rattling the windows with almost theatrical timing, as Inspector Dermot arrived an hour later. Despite the weather, the burly detective had managed to reach Thornfield Manor, his mackintosh dripping onto the parquet flooring of the entrance hall. "No one is to leave this house," he announced, surveying the assembled household with the stern gaze of a man who had seen too many country house murders to be impressed by titles or wealth. 2 deaths in one night suggests something very unpleasant indeed. The questioning took place in the drawing room, where a hastily built-up fire did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the gathering. Each person in turn professed to have been in their room when the music played its fateful melody for the second time. "And yet," Inspector Dermot remarked, turning the key to Sir Edgar's study over in his large, capable hands, "this was found in Sir Edgar's dressing-gown pocket. The connecting door between study and library was locked from the study side. How then did our music box travel from the locked study to the library desk? And more to the point, who moved it?" Miss Marple, observing quietly from her armchair near the fire, had been making mental notes. Young Miss Delaney's fingers were stained with what appeared to be ink, though she had claimed to have retired directly after dinner. Frederick Carrington's gaze kept returning to his father's desk, rather than to the corpse that had been removed from it. Most tellingly, Dr. Rawlings had shown an unnatural interest in the professor's belongings, as they were catalogued by the inspector's constable. "Inspector," Mildred Carrington's voice cut through the murmured conversations, "there's something you should know about that music box." All eyes turned to Sir Edgar's sister, a tall, angular woman whose grey hair was arranged in a severe style that emphasized the sharpness of her features. "My brother and Professor Hammond had been rivals for that item at auction. Edgar outbid him quite significantly. I believe there was bad blood between them over it." "Indeed," the inspector raised a bushy eyebrow. "And why might that be, madam?" The professor was something of an authority on such pieces. He once published a scholarly paper on what he called musical memento mori, compositions designed to commemorate or even predict death. Her thin lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile. "Rather ironic, wouldn't you say?" Later, as rain continued to lash against the windows and the wind howled like a mourner round the eaves, Miss Marple found herself taking tea with Mrs. Clement in a small morning room that seemed to have escaped the general gloom of the house. "Such a dreadful business," the vicar's wife whispered, though they were quite alone. "And to think, Professor Hammond had been visiting St. Mary Mead regularly these past months, though never to see Sir Edgar, as far as I'm aware." Miss Marple set down her teacup with delicate precision. "How very interesting. Did his visits happen to coincide with anything in particular?" Mrs. Clement furrowed her brow in thought. "Well, now that you mention it, he was often in the village on Thursdays. That's when Lady Carrington comes for the charity committee meetings at the vicarage." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes took on the distant expression that her nephew Raymond was fond of describing as her connecting the knitting pattern look. Most illuminating, the afternoon brought a new development. Inspector Dermot had discovered a notebook in Professor Hammond's valise, containing what appeared to be a partial translation of the ballad played by the music box. He gathered everyone in the drawing-room once more, his weathered face grave as he read aloud. "First falls the Lord by trusted hand, then wisdom's voice shall silent be. The keeper of the keys comes next, and youth's bright promise dashed to flames shall be." He looked up from the page. The remaining verses have been deliberately obscured, spilled ink by the look of it. As if on cue, the lights flickered ominously, the storm still exerting its influence on the rural electricity supply. When they stabilized, a collective gasp went round the room. "Where is Miss Carrington?" demanded the inspector, suddenly alert. Indeed, Mildred Carrington, who had been standing by the fireplace not moments before, was no longer present. A frantic search ensued, with constables and household members alike calling Miss Carrington's name through the winding corridors and numerous rooms of the old house. It was Frederick who thought to check the cellar, only to find the heavy oak door locked from within. "She must be in there," he shouted over the din of the storm. "We'll have to break it down." As the inspector and his men threw their combined weight against the unyielding wood, a sound floated down from the upper regions of the house, the delicate, chilling melody of the music box playing once more, barely audible over the howling gale outside. Miss Marple, standing apart from the group with her knitting clutched forgotten in her hands, recalled the verse they had just heard. "The keeper of the keys comes next," she murmured, her eyes widening with sudden comprehension. "Oh dear, I'm very much afraid we may be too late." The cellar door finally splintered inward under the assault, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The inspector's torch beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the still figure at the bottom of the stairs. Mildred Carrington would never again keep the keys to Thornfield Manor. Around her neck, the silk scarf she had worn at dinner was twisted into a grotesque parody of an elaborate necklace. Beside her outstretched hand lay a ring of household keys, meticulously arranged in a perfect circle. Above them, the music box's melody reached its final haunting note, then fell silent, as if satisfied with its third victim. Chapter 3. The Ballad's Verses. The discovery of Mildred Carrington's body cast a pall over Thornfield Manor that even the gradual abating of the storm could not disperse. In the drawing-room, Inspector Dermot had assembled the remaining members of the household, his weathered face grim as he consulted his notebook. "3 deaths," he said, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Sir Edgar, the lord of the manor, Professor Hammond, certainly a voice of wisdom in his field, and now Miss Carrington, who quite literally kept the keys of this household." He looked up, his gaze moving from face to face, all following the exact sequence predicted in that ballad. Miss Marple, knitting needles clicking softly, spoke without looking up from her work. "And the next verse, Inspector, youth's bright promise dashed to flames shall be, was it not?" A sudden cry from Eliza Delaney drew all eyes to the young pianist. Her face had gone quite white, her hands trembling so violently that she sloshed tea onto her dress. "I know nothing about this terrible business," she stammered. "Nothing at all." Frederick Carrington, standing by the fireplace, turned to face her. At 28, he was the very image of youth, interrupted, handsome features marred by the perpetual furrow between his brows, athletic build betrayed by the slight stoop of his shoulders. "Nor do I," he said, his voice tight. "But it seems that one of us is marked as the next victim, Miss Delaney. Both of you will remain in this room under observation," Inspector Dermot declared. "Constable Morris and Constable Parker will stay with you. No one is to leave under any circumstances." As the inspector departed to make arrangements for the removal of Mildred's body, Eliza collapsed into fresh hysteria. "I can't bear it," she cried, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. "I never should have come to this dreadful house." "Yet you did come, Miss Delaney," observed Miss Marple gently. "Might one inquire why? I understand you're a concert pianist of some promise, but you seem a rather unusual addition to what was otherwise a family gathering." The young woman's eyes darted nervously to Dr. Rawlings, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings. "I was invited by Lady Carrington. We share an interest in music." "Indeed? How interesting." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "And your acquaintance with Professor Hammond, was that also through music?" A tense silence followed this innocent query. Then, with the suddenness of a dam breaking, Eliza's composure shattered entirely. "He was my teacher," she cried, Years ago at the conservatory, I hadn't seen him in ages until recently, but I had nothing to do with his death, or Sir Edgar's, or Miss Carrington's. You must believe me." From his position near the door, Dr. Rawlings cleared his throat. "Miss Delaney is being somewhat modest about her connection to the professor. I happened to overhear them in what appeared to be a rather heated disagreement yesterday afternoon before dinner." Frederick Carrington's eyes narrowed. "What exactly were they arguing about, Doctor?" Before Rawlings could respond, Inspector Dermot returned, accompanied by a visibly distressed Lady Carrington. Her face, already pale, seemed to have aged years in the hours since her husband's death. "Inspector," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I understand you wish to speak with me about my movements yesterday evening." "Indeed, Lady Carrington." The inspector gestured toward a chair. "But first, I believe we should address the matter of this music box, which seems to be at the heart of our troubles." While the questioning continued, Miss Marple had quietly excused herself, explaining that she wished to fetch a different wool from her room. Instead, she embarked on a careful exploration of the house itself, her keen eyes noting details that others might overlook. The Tudor manor, she discovered, possessed quite remarkable acoustical properties. Standing in a small alcove on the second floor, she could hear with perfect clarity a conversation taking place in the library below, a quirk of architecture involving an old ventilation system. More curious still was her realization that the music box's melody, which had seemed to emanate from different locations each time it played, could not possibly have done so if the box itself remained stationary. Much like young Tommy Jenkins with his ventriloquism at the church fete, she murmured to herself. Most instructive, upon her return to the drawing-room she found Frederick Carrington engaged in a heated exchange with Inspector Dermot. "I insist on seeing my father's will," Frederick was saying. "As his heir, I have every right." "Your rights, Mr. Carrington, are somewhat circumscribed by the fact that we are investigating multiple murders," the inspector replied dryly. "However, if you feel it pertinent to the case," he hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. We shall open Sir Edgar's study together, with everyone present." The study, when finally unlocked, appeared exactly as Sir Edgar had left it. The music box sat innocently in its locked case on the desk, showing no signs of having been moved. As Frederick rifled through papers in a drawer, Dr. Rawlings commented offhandedly, "Of course, with Sir Edgar's heart condition, it's possible his death was indeed natural, however suspicious the timing." Miss Marple observed Lady Carrington's expression at these words, a flash of genuine surprise quickly masked by grief. "How very interesting," she murmured to herself. That evening, after a subdued dinner during which no one showed much appetite, Miss Marple requested permission to examine the music box under the inspector's supervision. "I confess to knowing very little about such things," she explained with disarming modesty. "But I've always found that objects sometimes speak quite clearly if one knows how to listen." With gloved hands she turned the ornate box, studying the painted scenes that adorned its surface. "These aren't merely decorative, are they?" she remarked. "They tell a story, the same story as the ballad, I believe." Her finger traced the progression of scenes: a nobleman drinking from a goblet offered by a cloaked figure, a scholar falling forward onto a desk, a woman with keys lying on stone steps, and finally, a disturbing image of a figure seated at a piano, flames rising around them. "Most unsettling," she said softly. "Inspector, might I suggest that Mr. Frederick be moved to a room without a fireplace? It seems a sensible precaution, given the circumstances." The inspector regarded her with a mixture of puzzlement and dismissal. "I appreciate your concern, Miss Marple, but I've stationed constables throughout the house. Carrington will be quite safe where he is." "Oh dear," she sighed. "I do hope you're right." As night fell once more over Thornfield Manor, the household settled into an uneasy silence. Despite the presence of policemen, a sense of dread hung in the air, as palpable as the lingering scent of beeswax and death. Miss Marple, seated in her bedroom with a novel she had no intention of reading, listened to the house as it creaked and settled. Each sound, a floorboard's protest, the tap of a branch against glass, the distant closing of a door, carried with it the possibility of new horrors. The clock on her bedside table had just marked the quarter to midnight when a commotion erupted somewhere down the corridor. Hastily donning her dressing gown, she hurried toward the source of the disturbance, Frederick's room, from which alarmed shouts and the acrid smell of smoke now emanated. The scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos. Frederick Carrington stood in the center of the room, beating frantically at his smoking dressing gown while Constable Morris attempted to help. Near the fireplace lay an overturned brandy glass, its contents having apparently ignited the silk garment. "Stand still, sir," the constable was saying. "Let me help you." By the time Inspector Dermot arrived, the fire had been extinguished, leaving Frederick with minor burns to his hands and a thoroughly scorched dressing gown. "It just caught fire," he was explaining shakily. "I was having a nightcap by the fire, reading, and the next thing I knew, 'Youth's bright promise dashed to flames shall be,'" quoted the inspector grimly. "It seems our unknown killer is determined to follow the ballad to the letter, though thankfully with less success in your case, Mr. Carrington." As Dr. Rawlings was summoned to tend to Frederick's burns, a familiar sound drifted through the house, the haunting melody of the music box, playing its warning once more. Miss Marple, counting heads in the gathering crowd of nightgown-clad guests and constables, suddenly realized what the others had not yet noticed. With uncharacteristic urgency, she plucked at the inspector's sleeve. "Where," she asked, her voice sharp with concern, "is Lady Carrington?" Chapter 4. Hidden Mechanisms. "Lady Carrington is missing?" Inspector Dermot's voice cut through the commotion surrounding Frederick's scorched dressing gown. "Search the house immediately." The ensuing hunt through Thornfield Manor's labyrinthine corridors yielded nothing but empty rooms and mounting apprehension. It was Constable Parker who finally reported the most disturbing discovery. "Sir, Lady Carrington's bedchamber," he began, his young face flushed with exertion. "Yes. What of it?" snapped the inspector. "It shows signs of hasty packing, sir. Several garments missing from the wardrobe, toiletries gone from the dressing table." Miss Marple, who had accompanied Mrs. Clement to Lady Carrington's room to identify what might be missing, bent to examine the carpet beneath the window. "Inspector," she called softly, "you might wish to look at this." Dermot crouched beside her, his torch illuminating a series of fresh muddy footprints on the Aubusson carpet, footprints coming in through the window rather than going out. "Someone climbed in," he muttered, "but did they leave the same way, taking Lady Carrington with them, or did she flee of her own accord?" Frederick Carrington, his burned hands now bandaged, stood in the doorway. His face, already pale from shock, had taken on a ghastly hue in the harsh beam of the inspector's torch. "I know something," he said, his voice hollow, "something about my stepmother that I should have mentioned earlier." All eyes turned to him. "She was having an affair with Professor Hammond." The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond. "I saw them together in London 3 months ago, at a cafe in Bloomsbury. They were intimate. I didn't tell my father. I thought it would break his heart." Dr. Rawlings cleared his throat. "If I might interject, Inspector, while this provides a potential motive for Sir Edgar's murder, it hardly explains the subsequent deaths, particularly that of Professor Hammond himself. Unless," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the affair was merely a cover for something else entirely." The storm had finally exhausted itself by morning, leaving a rain-washed calm over the countryside. With the roads passable once more, additional police arrived, bringing with them a more methodical approach to the investigation. As breakfast was served in the dining room, a meal that few had the stomach to enjoy, Dr. Rawlings made a discovery that would further complicate the already tangled web of mysteries. Miss Marple suggested I examine the music box more carefully, he explained, setting the ornate object on the table before Inspector Dermot. "Look here." With practiced fingers he pressed a nearly invisible catch in the box's ornate metalwork. A hidden compartment sprang open, revealing a yellowed photograph. Good Lord, breathed the inspector, lifting the image for closer inspection. The photograph showed a young woman in 1920s attire, her bobbed hair and confident smile striking in their modernity. But it was her face that caused Frederick to gasp in recognition. "It's Eliza Delaney," he exclaimed. "But how?" Dr. Rawlings turned the photograph over, revealing spidery handwriting on the back. "Eleanor, 1925, he read aloud. Confronted with this evidence, Eliza's composure crumbled entirely. Her face, usually so carefully arranged in expressions of demure politeness, contorted with raw emotion. "It's not me," she whispered. "It's my grandmother, Eleanor Delaney." "Your grandmother," prompted Inspector Dermot. Eliza swallowed hard. "She committed suicide in 1925, after a love affair with a married man went wrong. At least, that's what I was told." Her next words fell into the stunned silence like pebbles into a deep well. "I sought out Professor Hammond because of his research into the music box. I believed it might be connected to her death somehow, but I swear I had nothing to do with these murders." Miss Marple regarded the young woman thoughtfully, her needles moving in a steady rhythm as she knitted. "And when did you make this connection, my dear?" "Last month, I found letters in my mother's attic, correspondence between my grandmother and someone named Hammond. When I read about Professor Hammond's work on musical artifacts, I wondered if there might be a connection." Later that night, after a day of fruitless searching for Lady Carrington, Miss Marple requested a private audience with Inspector Dermot and the vicar in the library. "I believe," she began, settling herself comfortably in an armchair, "that I may have observed something about the music box's melody that might be pertinent to our investigation." The inspector, exhausted from the day's efforts, made a valiant attempt to appear interested. "Indeed, Miss Marple, when one has spent as many years as I have listening to the village choir, not always in perfect harmony, I'm afraid one develops a certain ear for layered sounds." She smiled apologetically. "The melody played by the music box is actually two separate tunes layered together." "Two tunes?" The vicar leaned forward. "How extraordinary. One is indeed the folk ballad that Professor Hammond identified, but beneath it runs another, older melody, one that I recall from my youth." Before she could elaborate, a constable burst into the room. "Inspector, Dr. Rawlings has just received an urgent message from the village hospital about a patient. He's insisting he be allowed to leave immediately." Dermot was on his feet at once. "Where is he now?" "In his room, sir, packing his medical bag, but when they reached the doctor's chamber they found it empty, the window standing open to the night air." "He's gone," the inspector growled. "But how? We've had men watching all the exits." Miss Marple, who had followed at her own more sedate pace, glanced around the room with eyes that missed nothing. "I believe," she said, "that Thornfield Manor may have secrets unknown even to its late master." A second, more thorough search of the house revealed what had been overlooked before, a narrow servant's passage hidden behind a panel in the dining room wainscoting. The passage, dusty with disuse, led directly to what had once been a gardener's cottage on the grounds. The cottage, when they reached it through a drizzling rain, bore signs of recent habitation. A cot with rumpled bedding stood in one corner, a small table and chair in another. On the table lay sheet music, the same haunting ballad played by the music box. "Someone has been living here," murmured the inspector. "Secretly and recently." Miss Marple, examining the sheet music, nodded sadly. "Yes, Inspector."
"And I believe I may know who."
The following morning brought reinforcements from the county police, along with a more thorough examination of Sir Edgar's papers. Among them, Inspector Dermot discovered correspondence that cast a new light on the collector's interest in the music box. "Listen to this," he said, reading from a letter found in a locked drawer of the study desk. "Regarding your inquiry into the former patient, Eleanor Delaney, we regret that our records from 1925 to 1930 are incomplete due to the fire that damaged the east wing of the asylum in 1931. Frederick Carrington paled visibly. Asylum? What asylum? Broadmoor, replied the inspector grimly. It seems your father was investigating the provenance of the music box with unusual determination. The afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the grounds of Thornfield Manor when the music box began to play its haunting melody once more. This time, however, the sound did not emanate from within the house. Miss Marple, who had been taking the air on the terrace, cocked her head like a bird attuned to an unusual call. The conservatory, she said, more to herself than to Constable Morris, who had been assigned to accompany her. Moving with surprising speed for a lady of her years, she made her way around the side of the house toward an old glass structure almost hidden by years of neglect and overgrown shrubbery. Through its dirt-streaked panes, a scene unfolded that caused her to catch her breath. Lady Carrington stood beside a freshly dug pit among the rose bushes, a revolver held steadily in her gloved hand. Opposite her, Dr. Rawlings knelt at the edge of the excavation, sweat beading on his brow, despite the cool autumn air. Even through the grimy glass, Miss Marple could see that they were engaged in a heated dispute, though their words were inaudible. What was abundantly clear, however, was that the doctor was digging under duress, and that the pit bore all the characteristics of a grave. "Constable," Miss Marple whispered urgently, "fetch the inspector at once. I believe we may have found Lady Carrington." Chapter 5. The Grave in the Garden. Within minutes, the overgrown garden surrounding the conservatory was alive with activity. Inspector Dermot, alerted by Constable Morris's breathless report, had mobilized his men with military precision. "Surround the structure," he ordered in a low voice. "No one fires unless I give the command." From her position behind a gnarled oak tree, Miss Marple observed the unfolding drama with a curious mixture of sadness and satisfaction. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a picture far more complex than even she had initially suspected. The police entered the conservatory with a crash of breaking glass. Lady Carrington, startled by their sudden appearance, discharged a wild shot that shattered a pane above the inspector's head before being swiftly disarmed. "Lady Carrington," the inspector said grimly, "I am arresting you on suspicion of murder, Doctor." Rawlings, trembling with exhaustion or fear, perhaps both, slumped against the edge of the partially excavated pit. "Thank God you've come," he gasped. "She's mad, utterly mad." Lady Carrington's laugh held no trace of hysteria, only a cold determination that Miss Marple found far more disturbing. "Finish the digging, Doctor," she said. "Let them see what lies beneath." Under the watchful eye of the police, Dr. Rawlings resumed his grim task. It did not take long before his spade struck something solid. With exaggerated care, the doctor and two constables removed the last layer of soil, revealing a bundle wrapped in decaying fabric. "Careful now," instructed Inspector Dermot. "This is evidence." The bundle, when fully exhumed and gently laid on the ground beside the pit, proved to contain human remains, a woman's skeleton, still partially clothed in the tattered remnants of a dress that, even in its decomposed state, was recognizably from the 1920s. On the skeletal hand, a gold wedding band caught the afternoon light. Inspector Dermot bent to examine it. "There's an inscription," he announced. "Eleanor, beloved." Lady Carrington, now securely handcuffed, smiled thinly. "My mother," she said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion, "murdered and buried here 40 years ago." Back in the drawing room of Thornfield Manor, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Lady Carrington sat rigidly in an armchair, a police constable standing at attention behind her. Rawlings occupied the sofa, a blanket around his shoulders despite the warmth of the fire, his face ashen. "I knew nothing about the body," he insisted. "Nothing. I was forced at gunpoint to help exhume it." Lady Carrington's laugh was a brittle sound, like ice cracking on a winter pond. How convenient for you, Doctor. And I suppose you knew nothing about the other deaths, either? I demand separate interrogations, Dr. Rawlings appealed to Inspector Dermot. This woman is clearly attempting to implicate me in her crimes. While this confrontation unfolded, Miss Marple had quietly enlisted Frederick's help in examining the music box mechanism more thoroughly. Despite his bandaged hands, the young man displayed an unexpected dexterity with mechanical devices. "There's something very odd here," he murmured, peering into the box's interior. "The mechanism is far more complex than it should be for a piece of this period." Indeed, Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Look here," Frederick pointed with a pencil tip. "There are 3 separate music cylinders, not just one, and this is a clockwork timer. It's been set to trigger the mechanism at specific times." "How very ingenious," Miss Marple remarked. "And quite illuminating." Their examination was interrupted by the arrival of a constable bearing a dusty box. "Inspector, we found this hidden in a secret drawer in Sir Edgar's desk. Thought you might want to see it straight away." The box contained yellowed newspaper clippings, meticulously preserved between sheets of tissue paper. Inspector Dermot read the uppermost headline aloud: "Industrialist acquitted in death of music teacher. Dated June 1926. "Let me see that," Frederick demanded, reaching for the clipping with a trembling hand. The article detailed the sensational trial of a wealthy industrialist named Joseph Delaney, accused of murdering his wife's lover, a music teacher. Despite compelling evidence, Delaney had been acquitted, though the scandal had ruined his social standing. A smaller article, dated 3 months later, reported that the industrialist's wife, Eleanor Delaney, had suffered a nervous breakdown and been committed to a private asylum. "Joseph Delaney," Frederick read, his voice hollow. "My father's name was Edgar Carrington." "Was it?" Lady Carrington's voice sliced through the tension like a razor. "How interesting that you should believe that." Before this cryptic statement could be explored, another commotion erupted from upstairs. Constable Parker burst into the room, his young face flushed with excitement. "Inspector! Miss Delaney has disappeared from her room." A thorough search of the house commenced once more. It was Miss Marple who suggested checking the attic, a suggestion that drew curious glances but was nevertheless acted upon. The attic of Thornfield Manor was a vast space, cluttered with the accumulated detritus of generations. Trunks of outdated clothing, furniture fallen from fashion, paintings deemed unworthy of display, all gathered dust beneath the rafters. In a far corner, partially concealed behind a Victorian screen, they found Eliza Delaney unconscious on the floor. Beside her lay an open trunk containing theatrical costumes and makeup of professional quality, along with a leather-bound journal. The inspector bent to examine the volume. "It's a diary," he announced. "Signed by Eleanor Delaney. The last entry is dated September 19th, 1925. As Dr. Rawlings reluctantly administered smelling salts to revive the young pianist, the haunting melody of the music box began to play once more, except that this time, as Miss Marple had expected, the sound was not coming from the box in Frederick's hands. "This way," she instructed, moving with surprising agility for a woman of her years. "Do follow the sound, Inspector." The melody led them to a wooden panel in the far wall of the attic, unremarkable save for a thin seam around its edges. As the final notes of the tune faded, there was a distinct click, and the panel slid smoothly aside, revealing a small hidden room beyond. The space contained a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a chair, all showing signs of regular use. Notebooks lined a makeshift shelf, their spines labeled with consecutive years from 1925 to the present. On the desk sat a framed photograph showing 3 women together, an elderly Eleanor, recognizable from the photograph found in the music box, a younger Eliza, and a third woman whose face had been carefully excised from the image. Most disturbing of all, however, was the message scrawled on the wall behind the desk, in what appeared to be dried blood. "The final verse is justice. My God, breathed Inspector Dermot. Someone has been living here all this time right under Sir Edgar's nose. Not someone, Inspector, corrected Miss Marple gently. Eleanor Delaney herself. Lady Carrington, who had been brought to the attic under guard, moved forward to stand beside the elderly spinster. For the first time since her discovery in the conservatory, her composure wavered. How long have you known? She asked quietly. Since the music box played its melody the second time, Miss Marple replied. Rawlings reacted to the discovery of the hidden compartment. She turned to the inspector. I believe, Inspector, that we are ready for the final act in this most distressing drama. As if on cue, Eliza Delaney stirred and opened her eyes, taking in the assembled group with momentary confusion before her gaze settled on the open panel in the wall. Grandmother, she whispered. Oh, grandmother, what have you done? Chapter 6. The music stops. The drawing room of Thornfield Manor had taken on the atmosphere of a theatre in the moments before the final curtain. The storm that had raged so violently during the early stages of their ordeal had given way to an unsettling calm, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the gentle crackle of the fire. Outside, twilight was settling over the gardens where Eleanor Delaney's remains had at last been discovered after 40 years. Inspector Dermot had arranged the seating with the precision of a stage manager. Lady Carrington occupied an armchair near the fire, her posture rigidly upright, despite the handcuffs that bound her wrists. Dr. Rawlings sat on the sofa as far from her as possible, his medical bag recovered from the gardener's cottage at his feet. Frederick Carrington stood by the mantelpiece, his bandaged hands clasped before him, while Eliza Delaney perched on a chair near the door, her face pale but composed after her ordeal in the attic. The vicar and his wife had been relegated to a small settee in the corner, where Mrs. Clement occasionally dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. At the center of this tableau stood Miss Marple, her knitting set aside for once, her faded blue eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face. If you would be so kind, Miss Marple, Inspector Dermot prompted, perhaps you might share your observations with us. Oh dear, she began with a self-deprecating smile that belied the sharpness of her gaze. I'm afraid I'm not very good at this sort of thing, not like those clever detectives in books, but I have had occasion to observe human nature over the years, and people are really very much the same in St. Mary Mead as they are everywhere else. She paused, gathering her thoughts. This terrible business centers not around the music box itself, though it is indeed a remarkable device, but rather what it represented, proof of a decades-old crime and an elaborate revenge planned over generations. The murdered music teacher, Frederick said suddenly. Hammond's father? Precisely, nodded Miss Marple. You see, Eleanor Delaney never committed suicide, nor was she truly insane, though the world was led to believe both. She was the wife of industrialist Joseph Delaney, who discovered her affair with a music teacher named Hammond, Professor Hammond's father. Lady Carrington's eyes never left Miss Marple's face as she continued. Joseph murdered the teacher in a jealous rage but arranged matters to make it appear as suicide. When Eleanor threatened to expose him, he had her committed to an asylum, using his considerable wealth and influence to have her declared insane. But my grandmother's grave, we just found it. Eliza protested weakly. What you found, my dear, were indeed human remains in your grandmother's clothing, wearing her wedding ring. But I suspect that when those bones are properly examined, they will prove to belong to another woman entirely, perhaps a patient who died at the asylum, and whose body was used to fabricate Eleanor's supposed suicide. Dr. Rawlings shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. This is all very interesting, but what has it to do with the current deaths? Everything, Doctor, Miss Marple replied serenely. Eleanor eventually escaped the asylum, but knowing she would be hunted if discovered alive, concealed herself in the one place no one would think to look. The home of her former lover's family, who sheltered her out of loyalty to their murdered relative. There she lived for decades in that hidden attic room, raising her daughter who had been born in the asylum, and later helping to raise her granddaughter, Eliza. All the while, she was meticulously planning her revenge against the Delaney family. But Sir Edgar, my father, his name was Carrington, Frederick insisted, though doubt had crept into his voice. The music box was the final piece of evidence Eleanor sought, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but relentless. It had belonged to the Hammond family and contained a hidden recording of Joseph Delaney confessing to the murder of Hammond Sr. and threatening Eleanor, a recording made using technology rather ahead of its time, created by the elder Hammond, who was not just a musician but an inventor of some ingenuity. She turned to Frederick. The most tragic aspect of this affair, Mr. Carrington, is that Sir Edgar Carrington was in fact Joseph Delaney. He changed his identity after the scandal and rebuilt his fortune. Eleanor had tracked him down after decades of searching, using her granddaughter Eliza to gain access to his home through the dinner party invitation. A stunned silence greeted this revelation. Frederick slumped against the mantelpiece, his face ashen. "But if what you say is true," the inspector interjected, "and Eleanor Delaney orchestrated all this, why have we not found her? The attic room suggests recent occupation, yet the body in the garden has clearly been there for decades." "Because Eleanor did not commit these murders herself," Miss Marple explained. "She died, naturally, just a few months ago after setting her plan in motion. The killer was acting on her behalf, following a script Eleanor had written years before, a script following the verses of the ballad played by the music box." All eyes turned to Lady Carrington, who met their gaze with a cold smile that transformed her elegant features into something altogether more dangerous. "You're half right, Miss Marple," she said calmly. "Eleanor did die. My mother suffered enough in her lifetime. I promised her justice would be served." For the first time since the investigation began, Lady Carrington, or rather the woman who had presented herself as such, appeared entirely at ease. The mask of genteel sophistication had slipped, revealing beneath it a hardness born of decades of careful planning. "My mother escaped from Broadmoor in 1926, 8 months pregnant with me," she continued, her voice eerily detached. "The Hammonds sheltered her in that attic room where I was born and raised in secrecy. My entire childhood was spent learning about Joseph Delaney's crimes and preparing for the day we would make him pay." "So you are Eleanor's daughter," Inspector Dermot clarified, "but not Sir Edgar's wife?" "Oh, I married him, Inspector. That was central to our plan. For 20 years I lived among society as Lydia Weatherby, establishing a separate identity from the daughter Eleanor secretly raised in the attic. When I was 30, I deliberately arranged to meet Joseph Delaney, by then reinvented as the respectable Sir Edgar Carrington. I made myself everything he desired in a second wife." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "You waited for the music box to surface at auction, knowing he would purchase it without recognizing its significance." "It took longer than we expected," Lady Carrington admitted. "The box had been in a private collection in Switzerland for decades. When it finally appeared in a London auction house, I made certain Sir Edgar learned of it and of Professor Hammond's interest in acquiring it." "Professor Hammond," Miss Marple mused. "He was never your lover, was he?" A flicker of genuine emotion, something like grief, crossed Lady Carrington's face. "He was my half-brother, Joseph's legitimate son. When he discovered who I was and what I planned, he attempted to blackmail me rather than help expose his father." Her voice hardened. "He betrayed his own mother's memory to protect a murderer. And Mildred Carrington?" asked the inspector. "Joseph's sister had been his accomplice in the original crime. She helped him commit my mother and forged the documents declaring her suicide. She deserved her fate." Frederick, who had listened to this recitation with mounting horror, suddenly straightened. "And me? Where do I fit into this nightmare? Am I truly Delaney's son?" Lady Carrington's laugh held no warmth. You are Eleanor's grandson, not Joseph's son. Your mother was Joseph's daughter from his first marriage. She had what he called a shameful pregnancy. At 19, a love affair with a musician. Ironically enough, Joseph forced her to give you up for adoption. Then later, when his reputation needed rehabilitating, he adopted you himself, never telling you or anyone else of your true parentage. Which makes you and Eliza cousins, Miss Marple concluded gently. Both Eleanor's grandchildren, though neither of you knew of your connection until Eliza began investigating her family history. Eliza, who had remained silent throughout these revelations, now spoke in a trembling voice. Grandmother told me to apply for the position as Sir Edgar's pianist for his musical evenings. She said it was important that I gain access to the house, but she never explained why. I had no idea what was being planned, because she protected you from it, Lady Carrington said, her tone softening slightly. Just as she tried to protect me, though I insisted on being her instrument of justice. And Dr. Rawlings, the inspector inquired, how does he feature in this web of deceit? The doctor shrank back as Lady Carrington's gaze fell upon him. Tell them, doctor. Tell them how you discovered my mother's existence 2 years ago when you attended Sir Edgar for a heart complaint and noticed the peculiar acoustics of the house. Tell them how you heard voices in the attic and investigated. Tell them how you've been blackmailing me ever since, threatening to expose Eleanor unless I paid you handsomely. That's a lie, doctor, Rawlings protested, though his face had gone the color of old putty. I knew nothing about any of this until recently. Then perhaps you'd care to explain, Miss Marple interjected mildly, why you attempted to flee with evidence from Professor Hammond's valise, or why you insisted on Sir Edgar's having a heart condition when Lady Carrington, who would surely have known of such a diagnosis, was clearly surprised by the mention of it. The doctor's eyes darted wildly around the room, seeking an escape that wasn't there. It was all her idea, he said finally, pointing a trembling finger at Lady Carrington. She planned everything. I only helped dispose of the professor's body because she threatened to implicate me in Sir Edgar's death. Ah, yes, Sir Edgar's death, Miss Marple murmured. Most ingenious. The music box doesn't merely play a song about revenge, does it? Its cylinders contain the actual confession, recorded decades ago using the elder Hammond's invention. Every time it played, Sir Edgar was hearing his own voice from the past condemning him, a voice he hadn't used since changing his identity, but which must have been horrifyingly familiar nonetheless. It gave him a heart attack, Lady Carrington confirmed, a note of satisfaction in her voice. Just as we'd planned, 40 years of living with his crimes and then to hear his own voice confessing them, his heart simply couldn't bear it. And the subsequent deaths followed the pattern laid out in Eleanor's plan, Miss Marple continued. Each murder choreographed according to the verses of the ballad, using theatrical skills you learned from your unconventional upbringing to play different roles and be in multiple places seemingly simultaneously. Inspector Dermot, who had been taking notes throughout this extraordinary confession, finally spoke. Lady Carrington, or whatever your actual name may be, you do realize that you've just confessed to multiple murders? My name is Catherine Delaney, she replied with quiet dignity. And yes, Inspector, I am fully aware of what I've done. Justice has been served. The music box has played its final melody. There will be a trial, the inspector warned. You will almost certainly hang. Catherine Delaney smiled, a peaceful expression that transformed her face into a startling echo of the young woman in the photograph from 1925. My mother waited 40 years for justice, Inspector. I can wait a few months more for my own sentence to be carried out. As the police led Catherine away, Frederick turned to Miss Marple, bewilderment written across his features. How did you know? About the recordings in the music box, about the identity of the bones in the garden, all of it. The box itself provided many of the clues, she replied. When I examined it, I noticed that the mechanism was far too complex for a simple music box. And there were other indications, Lady Carrington's surprise when Dr. Rawlings mentioned Sir Edgar's heart condition, the peculiar acoustics of the house that allowed sounds to travel in unexpected ways, and most tellingly, the dates in Eleanor's journal, echoed Eliza, who had moved to stand beside her newly discovered cousin. The journal found with you in the attic ended abruptly in September 1925, yet the notebooks in the hidden room were dated continuously from 1925 to the present year. Eleanor didn't die in 1925. She lived, hidden in this very house for decades afterward. In the days that followed, Eleanor Delaney's remains were properly interred in the village churchyard, with only Frederick, Eliza, the vicar, and Miss Marple in attendance. The cousins, drawn together by their shared history, had decided to honor their grandmother's memory by transforming Thornfield Manor into a music school bearing her name. On a mild autumn afternoon some months later, Miss Marple visited the manor at their invitation. In the garden, now carefully tended where once it had concealed a terrible secret, Frederick and Eliza showed her the memorial they had created, a simple stone bench beneath an oak tree, with the music box encased in glass beside it. "We've disabled the mechanism," Frederick explained. "It can never play again." "Some melodies," Miss Marple observed as they walked back toward the house, "are best left unplayed. Music speaks directly to the heart, bypassing the mind's careful defenses. That's what makes it so powerful, and sometimes so dangerous." As they crossed the lawn, the setting sun caught the windows of Thornfield Manor, turning them briefly to sheets of gold. The house that had witnessed so much tragedy now echoed with the sounds of students practicing scales and arpeggios, a more fitting tribute to Eleanor Delaney, Miss Marple thought, than any revenge could ever have been. "Will you stay for tea?" Eliza asked, linking her arm through the elderly lady's with newfound confidence. "Thank you, my dear, but I must return to St. Mary Mead. There's a meeting of the Women's Institute this evening, and I promised to bring my raspberry sponge." Miss Marple smiled, once again the unassuming village spinster that so many mistakenly dismissed. "But perhaps I might visit again in the spring. I understand you're planning a recital." As her train pulled away from the station, Miss Marple gazed out at the passing countryside, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. Like the music box, this case had contained hidden mechanisms, layers of deception and secrets that had taken years to unravel. Yet beneath it all lay the most common motive in the world, a mother's love for her child, twisted by circumstances into something dark and terrible. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected, one saw the same passions, the same human weaknesses, albeit expressed in less dramatic ways. A dispute over a jam recipe at the church fete might not lead to murder, but the pride and jealousy behind it were no different in essence from those that had driven Joseph Delaney to kill his wife's lover all those years ago. The train rounded a bend, and Thornfield Manor disappeared from view. With it went the final notes of a melody that had taken 40 years to play to its conclusion, a ballad of betrayal, revenge, and justice finally served. The music had stopped at last.